Just a moment ago, I was talking to the children about favorite teachers and how they help us to become the people that we are. One of my very favorite teachers was a woman named Eleanor Tinney. Miss Tinney was a science teacher, and even at the time that she was working with me, she was a science teacher past tense. She had already retired, but chose to come back to my high school to work with our students who were doing science projects for the Virginia Junior Academy of Science. She was the lady who would take the time to sit with us and say, do you really think that that's the best way to test your hypothesis? Could you do better? She's the one who would help us when we did the experiment to sit down and figure out how to do the statistics to make sure that the results that we thought we had were in fact the results that we did have. She is the woman who taught us how to do graphing and charting, how to use photographic evidence to support all the scientific work that we were doing. And she helped me in my science project my junior year. It was one of those projects that, well, it took a lot of doing. I was studying the growth responses of Endovia parasitica and Saccharomyces cerevisiae. By the way, that's brewer's yeast and chestnut-like fungus. Studying the growth responses to different athletes' foot medications. They didn't let us work with actual athletes' foot. That was just a bad idea. But anyway, Mrs. Tinney helped out with that, and she taught me how to use a stationary camera rig to photograph the petri dishes so that we could have a visual representation of those growth patterns. Mrs. Tinney, I think, as much as she loved science, loved photography. When she wasn't helping students with science projects, she was in fact the faculty, or former faculty, advisor to the photography club. And she issued us cameras. You know, actual cameras with film. Yeah. Yeah, that's a long time ago. But she gave us cameras and taught us how to compose shots, how to deal with focus and lighting. She taught us how to do art photography as well as sports photography. And she turned us loose. And many of us had photographs that were published in the newspaper that won photographic competitions. I've got ribbons from the state fair that remind me of Mrs. Tinney and of her love, not only of photography, but of her students. Now, it probably won't surprise you then to hear with all of that background, back in the days before everybody had a camera on their cell phone, I was the designated family photographer for my family. And if you go through the family photos that we have from the early days, you would think that Kimberly and Ian did all kinds of things without me ever being present. Because I was on the other side of the camera. These days, of course, everyone's got a camera on their cell phone, and we all use it not only to take pictures of what's going on out there, but to turn around and take selfies. By the way, thank you for standing up for that selfie earlier. Got to prove that we were all here today, don't we? Well, Jesus' followers didn't have Canon A1s. They certainly didn't have iPhones. They weren't taking any selfies. But on that day when Jesus asked Peter, James, and John to go up on the mountaintop with him, they all wished that they did. They weren't quite sure that that's what they were wishing, but they were wishing that they had cameras. They wished that they had some way of capturing the magic of that day. They walked up the mountain with Jesus, not knowing what to expect. They looked away for just a brief second, and when they turned back, they saw that Jesus was changed before their very eyes. No longer was he standing there dressed as he had been, but instead his clothes were glowing white, and his face shone. But even more strange, there were two others standing with him. Elijah, the great prophet, and Moses, the giver of the law, also standing on the mountaintop with their clothes radiating the glory of God. Peter, of course, the impetuous one who always spoke first, who acted often before he even thought, turned to Jesus and said, "Jesus, this is an amazing thing, and I wish I had a camera. I wish that I could get the three of you guys together so I could take a selfie with you." Okay, that's not quite what he said. He said, "This is an amazing thing. Let's build 3 booths, 3 shrines, so that we can remember how you and Elijah and Moses were here on the mountaintop. Let's build memorials. Let's find a way of remembering this thing forever, because it is amazing. And before he could finish his sentence, the voice of God spoke on that mountaintop. "This is my son, my beloved. Listen to him." Parenthetically, "and shut up, Peter." Well, that's what God was saying. I mean, when someone is speaking and the voice of God says, "Listen to this other person," it means talk a little bit less, doesn't it? Just in a polite, Gaudian way. And yes, I just made up that word too. And so Peter, James, and John fell silent. They fell, in fact, to the ground, burying their faces in their hands, recognizing that this voice of God speaking across the mountaintop, this radiance of God pouring forth from Jesus the Messiah, from Moses the lawgiver, and from Elijah the prophet, was more than they could view. They needed to close their eyes. They needed to take a moment apart. And then when they looked up, it was different again. Elijah, Moses were gone. Jesus stood there looking like nothing had happened. And then he said, "Okay, let's go back down the mountain. We've got some work to do." It's a strange story, isn't it? The disciples see the glory of God break into the world. They see the lawgiver and the prophet and the Messiah standing together. And then it's over. And they walk back down the hill. And they get back to work. What do we do with a story like that? It rolls around every year on the Sunday that stands right before the beginning of Lent. It reminds us that we need to go down into the valley and get back into the thick of things, that we can't stay here just on the mountaintop as we continue to celebrate this season of joy that follows through following Epiphany. But it also calls us to be aware, to remember with our eyes and our lives the experience of being in God's presence, to not try and memorialize things too much. This past Tuesday, as I was waking up, my clock radio went off, and I was listening to WNYC, and I heard a segment on New Tech City. Linda Henkel, who was a professor at Fairfield University, was speaking about an experiment that she had done. She had taken 74 people to an art museum. And some of them she had asked to photograph the things they saw, to use their cell phones. And another group she asked, don't use your phones. Just observe and remember. Later, she asked the 74 questions about what they had seen. Now, you might think that people who were framing shots, who were lining up the art, who were taking the pictures, would have a stronger visual memory of what they had seen, but she found that wasn't the case. She found, in fact, that the people who were just snapping pictures as they went through the museum, in fact, remembered less than the people who kept their phones in their pockets. Now, as someone who encourages you to use social media as a way of reaching out to the world, you would think that this is a strange message for me to bring. That's because it is. But there was another study that I saw as I was preparing the sermon, because I wanted to make sure that I had the segment from New Tech City remembered correctly. And this study was actually reported by the British newspaper, The Guardian. And they found there was a difference between how people take pictures and how they remember. And I think it's important. You see, when someone just takes a picture, they don't notice. They just line up the camera, zap, it's done. But when they zoom in, and yes, I'm picking on you because you're the easiest subject at the moment. When they zoom in, they notice detail. And in that zooming, in that noticing of the detail, images stay in the mind, and images stay in the heart. For Peter, James, and John, they weren't zooming in so much. They just wanted to build some quick shrines. For us, when we take those quick snaps and we don't engage ourselves in what's going on, we miss out on what God is doing. But when we take a moment to focus, not just our cameras, but our hearts and our minds and our lives, when we focus our spirits on God's presence among us, we are transformed. We find that we have new ways of seeing, new ways of thinking, new ways of being, and even new ways of encountering God. May we then, on this Transfiguration Sunday, set aside that quick reflex for snapshots and instead focus on the deep experience of zooming in, of looking at what God is doing in our midst. And as we do so, may we indeed be blessed.